Hello, Pastor Ethan here from Leroy Covenant Church. All right, well, this video is part two of a two-part series looking through the Old Testament book of Daniel. Now, as you probably have gathered from the first video, we'll do a quick review here and then get into the material. Today's material will cover chapters 7 through 12, and these are unique and different from the first 6 chapters, and that's what we'll start talking about here. So Daniel, the book, is found among the prophets in the English Bible, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then Daniel. But in the Hebrew Bible, it is listed with more historical / poetic type of books, and that's because it is a little bit of both. That's how the material goes. So the first 6 chapters of Daniel are more of historical narrative, third-person narrative specifically for the most part, whereas this second 6 chapters are more visionary literature, specifically apocalyptic literature. So in the first chapter, it originally begins in Hebrew. The original documents are in Hebrew, and then for most of chapter 2 all the way through chapter 7, they are originally written in Aramaic, and then they go back to Hebrew in chapter 8 through 12. Now, the chapters between 2 and 7, the ones that are Aramaic, have their own structure to them. So we see some parallels between 2 and 7, 3 and 6, and 4 and 5, which is kind of at the heart of that structure. But kind of the heart of the book and the very important chapter, which summarizes a lot of things, but also connects the 2 sections, is chapter 7. So although chapter 7 is originally written in Aramaic and part it connects it, to the earlier part, but because it now begins this visionary, more apocalyptic literature, it also brings us into the second part of Daniel. So Daniel begins with history, this fact that Nebuchadnezzar II invaded Palestine in about 605 BC, and Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is their Babylonian names. They were taken captive, more like political prisoners, like propaganda pieces, to Babylonia. And while they were there, what they were supposed to do was to learn the culture, learn the religion, learn the language, learn all that stuff so they could enter back into the service for the state. And then probably the state could be like, look at how great of a country we are, that we took the captives and that we trained them to be useful to us, and that our God and our kingdom is better, kind of a thing. So that's what happens to Daniel and his 3 friends. Now they are part of the very first wave that goes into exile, and we'll get another big wave around 597 and then 587 /586 when Jerusalem is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. So they go into it, they enter service, and from what we know, at least of Daniel, is that he stays there for a long time, decades, and probably his 3 friends as well. And it isn't until 539 where Cyrus the Persian, and Persia was a massive empire, way bigger than Babylonia, he comes to power, and he issues a decree, as recorded elsewhere in the Old Testament, that the Jewish people could go back and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. That was huge. That was a signal that the captivity, the exile, was over. Yes, that's true, but that's kind of what chapters 7 through 12 will start to talk about and point even further into the future. So going back to those first 6 chapters, so that's kind of where Daniel and his friends are at, and they interact and they serve in the Babylonian court. And through that process, God speaks to and through them and shows the kings of the empires that Daniel serves throughout that time, and that his 3 friends do, that there is only one God, the God of Israel. He is sovereign over all. He can put anybody on the throne he wants to. He can take anybody down, but also that he is with his people even in exile. That's a message through them to the people that are in exile as well, that God's presence is actually more so with those in exile than those in Jerusalem, which is pretty amazing. We get that idea in Ezekiel, where the glory leaves the temple and goes east, goes towards the exiles. So even in this punishment of because of their sin, and that is why they're in exile, God is with them, and God is doing something. He's going to bring it to an end, bring them back to the land. And then throughout the years that are going to go, about the next 500 years after that, God is going to set the world stage up in such a way that Jesus will be born into a particular place, a particular time, and that time would be when the Roman government, the Roman Empire, is kind of in charge. But all this things had to lead up in such a way that he was born into the world at the perfect time, at the right time. Okay, so that's kind of chapters 1 through 6. 7 is that hinge chapter that brings us into this next set of the book. It changes genre. So we are now in mostly apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature, we have to understand, is highly symbolic literature. It's a message from the divine realm about realities of the divine, but also it kind of has a timeless message, a future-focused message, but also speaks to things in the present, because the point of apocalyptic literature is kind of twofold. One, to bring encouragement to people who are suffering, especially God's people. And number two, to call them back to God, to wake them up and to call them to be faithful to God. That is a point of apocalyptic literature, and it does so in very, very symbolic language. So when we see numbers, when we see colors, when we see just very elaborate things that are being described, like mutated or beasts or hybrid beasts and stuff like that, yes, Daniel saw that, and people see that, but that is not the literal meanings of those things. It's not that, okay, that beast that was described, that's exactly the beast that real humanity is going to see, like in 1,000 years, kind of a thing. It's supposed to mean something. It's symbolic for something. Same with colors, same with numbers. It's a deeper meaning to it. And that's usually how we have to understand it, because that's the genre we are in. So with that being said, let's jump into chapters 7 through 12, give us a little bit of information and an overview on it. So I'm going to grab my Bible if you want to grab yours as well. So this is Daniel chapter 7, and I'll just be following the NIV, and we're not reading it all, obviously, but we'll find out some more here. So in the first year, verse 1, of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was laying in his bed, and he wrote down the substance of his dream. Now, we have to remind ourselves that if we're thinking chronologically through this book, chapters 1 through 6 move along chronologically, but now in chapter 7 we are backtracking several years to Belshazzar. He was the last king of Babylon before he was defeated, and basically that was the beginning of that whole empire falling, and the Media-Persia kingdom coming up after that. So we're backtracking a little bit here to a vision that he had. Now, God gave Daniel the power and the ability to interpret dreams, but now Daniel here has dreams. This is the first of 4 visions that God gave Daniel, and they need to be interpreted for him. So the first vision, as we see in verses 2 through 7, involves beasts, 4 beasts that are coming out. And 4, we're going to see that number a lot in this chapter, symbolic number. Yes, there's 4 that's described, but it's kind of like this complete and wholeness type of number as well, because we also see that in verse 2, the 4 winds of heaven churning up the sea. So 4 winds, basically, just summarize that is all of the wind, very windy. It churns up the sea. The sea is raging. Now, the sea, according to ancient people, was a place of disorder, a place that was chaotic, and also a place that could be evil as well, because that's just how it could be seen. And the only thing or beings that could tame the sea were godly beings, were the divine, were some sort of gods or heavenly beings that could actually tame the sea. So if it's already this chaotic, disordered kind of evil realm, and we have hybrid, mutated, unclean beasts, as the Jewish people would see them, coming out of the sea, this is not good. Like, it's ominous language, okay? And the first 3 of the 4 beasts can be described with animals from the animal kingdom. So the first one is like a lion, verse 4, but it had the wings of an eagle. Verse 5, the second one was a bear. And verse 6, the other one was like a leopard. So Daniel sees these things, and all of these are described, and then all of them, either something is given to it, or it is given a command, or given something to do. So the first one, it has looks like a lion, has these wings, but then the wings are ripped off, and it's given the mind of a human. Okay. The second one, it's raised up on its sides, has ribs in its mouth, and it's told, get up and eat your fill of flesh, a command to go and conquer, to go back to battle. The fourth one, a leopard, also has 4 wings, 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. So some divine power behind this as well, or being allowed to do this. But then Daniel sees a fourth beast. This beast is very different. It's very powerful. It's very terrifying. He can't describe it with anything from the earthly realm, verse 7. And it also had 10 horns. But not only that, while Daniel's looking at this, another little horn comes up among those 10, pops out 3 of them, and then this little horn had eyes like a human being and spoke very boastfully. Ooh, this does not look good. These are not good things. Then all of a sudden the vision changes. And we're taking time in this chapter because this is a key chapter to really understand this. The vision changes, and we can almost see Daniel looking up, and he gets a picture into the throne room of heaven, but it's also a room of judgment. It's a court scene, a court session, so to speak. Thrones were set in place. And the Ancient of Days, so some basically at the base level, someone who is old, someone who is wise and respected. That term, Ancient of Days, only here in Daniel does it show up in the entire Old Testament. And the way he is described, this obviously is God. This is very similar to language that Ezekiel described a little bit as well, and we get that his throne was flaming with fire, and a river of fire was coming out with him. With all of that language of the thrones, the fire, and then the court was seated and the books were opened, this is a scene of judgment. Judgment specifically upon those beasts. We still don't know what they are, but judgment from God. Then he continued to watch the boastful words of the horn, verse 11, and he kept looking until that beast was destroyed and the power was taken away. So an end to it. Okay. Now it changes one more time in verse 13. He sees one like the Son of Man, which really is just a human being in this context, comes with the clouds of heaven. But that changes things. Only divine beings, only the gods ride on the clouds, like Baal, the pagan god, or like Yahweh. So, okay, this is a human figure, but also divine. Some people, they're trying to decide who this Son of Man is, and in the original context, how they would understand it would not be automatically Jesus. Jesus isn't on the scene for another several hundred years. They would have no idea what that means. But somehow, maybe this is a second Yahweh, so to speak. You could say another form. They would see it as like the angel of the Lord or something like that, because it's this dual figure. But either way, it went to the Ancient of Days. It was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All the nations and peoples worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never go away, and his kingdom will be one that never ends. So this divine human figure gets the power and glory and all the praise. And therefore, he is the one that will be he will establish and lead God's kingdom, this kingdom that will never fail. Okay, but now Daniel wants to know, okay, what does all that mean? Well, chapter 7 does not go into great specifics. It stays kind of vague. Chapter 8 will be much more explicit and detailed. But in verse 17, the 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise. But then a side note, but God's holy people will possess the kingdom and receive it and possess it forever. So despite what happens with these kingdoms, with these kings, with all these beasts and judgment language, like they'll come to an end and God's people will live forever. But he wants a little bit more information about this. So verse 21, we get kind of a scary thing that this horn that was raging war against the people was defeating the people, defeating God's people. But thankfully, the Ancient of Days defeats him and pronounces judgment. In verse 23, finally says the fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will come upon the earth. And it will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. So the idea here is most likely this is the kingdom of Greece. Some people might see it as Rome, but I think it's a little bit better of a fit for Greece. And then the kings that will come out of it, who eventually there's going to be this one king that stands out, verse 24 and 25. He will be different. He will speak against the Most High, oppress the people, but then the holy people will be delivered into his hand. So they will suffer. God's people will suffer. There'll be a time of great persecution under this king. But thankfully, again, chapter 7 brings us great hope. The court will sit, his power will be taken away, and he will be destroyed forever. And then all the kingdom and glory and power will be to God, God's people, and his kingdom will be established forever. So chapter 7 is actually a very hopeful chapter, but Daniel's disturbed by this dream. But then in chapter 8, we get a second dream that parallels that. This happens 2 years later, also with Belshazzar as the king, and this is at the very end of his reign. And we find here that now, though, Daniel in the vision is taken to a new location, and he's now outside of the realm of Babylonia. He is in the province of Elam, the citadel of Susa, by this Uli Canal, and that's outside of the kingdom of Babylon. But that makes sense because now we're switching. Babylonia is out of the picture now. This next kingdom is rising up, so it kind of makes sense of where he is getting this vision. And here he sees 2 domestic animals, and we'll speed this up a little bit. But one is a ram and the other is a goat. So this ram is very powerful. It had 2 big horns, and no animal could stand against it. Verses 3 through 4, it did as it pleased, and it was great. But then a goat shows up, verse 5. This goat has one very long horn, and it basically takes out the ram, and is very, very powerful. The goat became very great, verse 8, but at the height of its power, the horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of them came one other horn, verse 9, which started small but grew in great power. And then it goes on to describe, verse 11, it'll set itself up as great as the commander of the Lord's army. It will take away the daily sacrifice. The sanctuary will be thrown down. The Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. Very depressing language, whoever this is symbolically. And then what's going to happen here? Daniel's starting to try to figure out what's going to go on. How long is this going to go in the next few verses? And basically, there's a set period of time, but God's people are going to be persecuted. So in verse 15, they start to say again, like, how are we understanding this? We find Daniel is verse 18. He's in a deep sleep, his face to the ground. But then they start to tell them, like, okay, this is basically what it means. In verse 19, it concerns the time of the end. Now, probably this is not just the end of the world or the second coming of Jesus type of a thing. In the more immediate context, this is the end of when this really, really evil ruler is coming to power, which we'll find out this is in the 2nd century, okay, BCE. So the 2 ram horn, verse 20, represents the kings of Media and Persia. So the 2 horns, so Media and Persia. Persia is the one that's stronger. Persia has the longer horn. But then the shaggy goat is Greece. That is the kingdom that will arise in the 3rd century BCE. And the most powerful king is Alexander the Great, who was born, I think, in 330. Let me double check on that date. I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I couldn't think of it right off the top of my head. But Alexander the Great, but he only lives to be 33 years old, but is a very, very powerful kingdom. Okay, but 4 horns in verse 22 will come out of that. And these are the 4 generals that will take over after Alexander the Great dies. And the 4 kingdoms will emerge, but won't have the same power. Very true. In verse 23, though, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. Most people believe that the period of time from Alexander the Great, we fast forwarded about 100 years or so, 75 years. But the guy being described here is the same as that fourth beast, is the same as the after the goat here. This is Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, who was a very evil, arrogant, kind of strange character that was ruler of that period of time in the 2nd century BC, and he persecuted the Jewish people. He burned much of Jerusalem. He desecrated the temple. He took away the daily sacrifice. He wouldn't let people get circumcised. He wouldn't let people observe the Sabbath. He murdered Jews. He was a very, very evil person. And that's who we get described, verses 23 through 25. He will cause deceit to proffer. He will consider himself superior, verse 25. But he will destroy many and take a stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet, that was the but, the yet. At the end of verse 25, he will be destroyed. So thankfully there will be an end to him. But then again, hey, seal up this vision, Daniel, and he lay exhausted for days. But then he got up and went to his work. He realized he had to keep going because he had no control over these events. They're from the distant future, and he had to keep doing his job that God gave him to do. So now in verse 9, this becomes a little bit unique. Verse 9, for the most part, from verses 4 through 19, are a prayer of Daniel. So they start with an incredible confession until the last part that we get part of a supplication that he makes to God. And we fast forward in time a little bit. So now in the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, a Mede by descent. We talked about in the previous video, and I'll say it here again, that some believe, and I think this could be a good case, that Darius is one and the same with Cyrus the Great. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But this is the first year of their reign. Daniel has this now, what is going to be his third vision. But what it says, though, in verse 2 is that he understood something from Scripture. So before he gets this vision, he was studying Scripture. The word of the Lord, specifically the prophet Jeremiah, scrolls that were written from the prophet Jeremiah, whose ministry started and was before Daniel even went into exile and continued into this time of exile. That Daniel was studying this, that he had access to this, that not only do we find back in previous chapters, like chapter 6, that he spent every single day praying 3 times a day, but he also studied Scripture and he sought out God. And it says here that he pleaded with God and that he turned to the Lord with prayer and petition and fasting, sackcloth and ashes. This was serious stuff. Now, why would Daniel be doing this right now? Well, if this is the first year of Cyrus and he's just about, and probably Daniel knows that to issue this edict for the Jews to go back, this means that their time of exile, this means that their time of punishment is over. Wouldn't Daniel be excited? Why is he in verse 3 prayer and fasting and petition and sackcloth and ashes? Well, because he knows they went into exile because of sin. And has it really been purified? Has it really been done away with? Are they still sinful people? What if they go back into the land and continue to do it? Will they be exiled again? This is serious. They need to make themselves right before they go back. And not only that, but the nervousness and anxiety about trying to go back to a land you haven't been to in years, and just super scary. Now, Daniel himself has not gone back yet, but you can see why he feels a need to confess the sins of his people. We talked about this at Solomon's dedication of the temple, that if people were scattered about, that they would look towards Jerusalem and ask God to forgive their sins and to heal them and to bring them back. So Daniel knows he's got to do this. And like a true prophet, even though Daniel's different from the other prophets, he stands with the people. And he includes himself with it and says, we all have sinned. So he starts off and he confesses. And he first starts off by acknowledging God, verse 4, as a great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. God did that. So we're going to see in this prayer the difference between God and his sinful people. God is the one who's righteous. God is the one who's great and awesome. God is the one who started covenant. God's the one who keeps covenant and keeps his commands. The people do not, because in verse 5 we see, look at, these are all different Hebrew verbs, and they're all plural, we. We have sinned, we have done wrong, we have been wicked, we have rebelled, we have turned away, we have not listened to the prophets. They haven't done any of that. And you see this we versus your laws, your words, your prophets, God. So we are not listening to you. And that Hebrew word for listen is shema, can mean to listen, to hear, or to obey. We haven't obeyed, we haven't listened, but we're going to see at the very end of this prayer, he uses that word again, the Hebrew word, to say, Lord, now please, please, please listen and hear us this time. So God is the one who's righteous, but verse 7 and 8, they are filled with shame. The people are filled with shame because of what has happened to them. But they deserved it. They deserved it. But now Daniel appeals to this God who is righteous, this God who does everything right, and he wants to seek the favor of the Lord, and he goes back to the Exodus. The Exodus was the huge redemptive piece in Israel's history that showed that God loved his people, that God rescued his people, that God has the power to do it. And Daniel's saying, hey, because of your character and what you've done, do it again. So now in verses 17 through 19, basically, God, please hear our prayers and petitions. Hear us. Verse 17, verse 18, verse 19, Lord, listen. Lord, forgive us and bring us back. But then it transfers in the last of chapter 9, we find that because of his prayers, Gabriel, the angel, is sent to Daniel. And it says in verse 20, he has come to give him insight and understanding because, verse 23, he is highly esteemed. Now, why would he need insight and understanding after he just got done confessing? Well, he's going to tell him the things that are to come. He says in verse 24, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city. 77s. 70 weeks of years, more or less. So it'd be 70 times 7, literally would be 490 years. But that's a very symbolic number as well. Some people try to fit in that 490 to an exact time frame and chronology. It could, but it's very difficult to do that. Much likely, this is more of a symbolic number on two ends. One kind of a negative, but one positive. On the negative end, you see to finish the transgression, to an end to sin, and atone for wickedness. And 490 is much greater than 70. So they have been in exile for 70 years, but seems like they still have a lot more time to go until sin and everything's atoned for and all this is wrapped up. So God is saying, look, like, yes, you're going back, and yes, this is over, but it's not over yet. Like, there's still going to be hard times to come. People are still sinful. Not yet. But on the positive end, 490 is also kind of a symbolic number that relates back to the laws that God gave to the people of Israel as far as observing the Sabbath day. Every seventh day you observe the Sabbath. Every seventh year your land gets rest. And then every 7 cycles of 7, after that's done, after 49 years, then you have a year of Jubilee. And 49, if you times it by 10, which is another complete full number, you get 490. So also, if we think of it that, after that's done, well, Jubilee, right? Well, then he says, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place, verse 24. So something positive is coming to this as well. But then in verses 25 through 27, he more describes things that are going to come. Now, I want to make a note here that it says... no one understand this. From the time the word goes out to the rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt, the streets and entrenched, but in times of trouble. After 66 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. So the NIV does an interpretive step for you that is not so clear in Hebrew. In Hebrew, there is no definite article. It is not the anointed one. It is an anointed one. So, and the NIV capitalizes the A and the O, so you automatically think Jesus. Well, there again, too, in the immediate context, this would not necessarily be on the radar. Now, prophecy gets partially fulfilled in shorter term things, and ultimately we know Jesus is the anointed one. Jesus is the full fulfillment of that. But here in this context, most likely that first anointed one, the one who tells people to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, that's Cyrus. That's Cyrus the Great. An anointed one, he's called an anointed one back in Isaiah. An anointed one can just mean king or ruler. It doesn't have to be a Messiah figure. But then the anointed one that's put to death, a lot of people think this is Anias III, the last of the Zadokite high priest who was murdered during that very tumultuous time of the 2nd century BCE. So basically, there's going to be some really bad times until the temple is rededicated, which was in the 160s. I think 161 or 164. I don't know off the top of my head. That the temple is rededicated, and that's the beginning of the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, right? So, but he's going to say, verses 26, the end will come, war will continue until the end has been decreed, and then all this stuff is going to happen, and there's going to be this evil that's going to happen, again, pointing to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the abomination that causes desolation, also possibly a reference to future partially fulfilled there, but then fulfilled also when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and other things as well throughout our time. Until the end is decreed and poured out on him and judgment is made. Okay, so now we get into the last 3 chapters, and I don't want to spend forever on this, but this is the 4th vision Daniel gets. And in the first part, chapter 10, we're now caught up in chronology. He is in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. That's as far as we get historically in this book. And he gets a vision, this 4th one, that concerns a great war. Well, in Hebrew, that's a little ambiguous. Is the content of the message concerning a great war, or is how he got the message considered a great war, like a great battle and a fight? Probably a little bit of both here. So, because it says, for 3 weeks he fasted. He fasted, and he drank and drank no wine, and he had put no lotions on. I mean, he is in an intense part of fasting, and probably during the time and through the time of the great feast of Passover. So Daniel is dedicated here. So he's now in the Tigris, and physically, don't know how he got there. Verse 4. Verse 5, he looks up, a man comes to him and gives him a message. Some people think this is Gabriel. A few people think this might be a theophany. This might be God. I can see both for that as well, because how this person is described is very much like Ezekiel 1, and is also very much like going ahead to Revelation. So anyway, but he gets this vision, but we really don't get the content of it until the next chapter. But he's overwhelmed. All these verses I could just kind of summarize. He's completely out of strength. He's overwhelmed. He just is this is beyond him. He's trembling. But it says in verse 12, do not be afraid, because since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come to respond to you. So what we get next in verse 13, we get a very interesting thing about this prince of Persia. Going back to Deuteronomy and some other sections too, even after the Tower of Babel, this idea was believed that divine / heavenly cosmic beings were put in charge of states, of empires, of different kingdoms, and that God had put them there for good, but they rebelled and they didn't follow him. So this prince of Persia is some. It's not necessarily. This is not a positive being. It should have been, but it was not. It could have been something evil, or one that rebelled or sinned. But something stopped this vision from coming to Daniel right away. Okay, but the reason there might have been this pushback and this fight was that the Persian kingdom is now coming to an end, right? That's being described here, and a new kingdom is starting to come up. And this also, if Cyrus is letting the people go back to rebuild Jerusalem, if this is what's going to happen, the demonic realm, or the rebellious realm in the heavenlies does not want the Jewish people to go back and rebuild. So maybe that's why this hesitation. All that to say is that Daniel's overwhelmed, but verse 18, God says, do not be afraid, you are highly esteemed, peace, be strong, be strong. Finally, he gets strength, and then the person tells him, verse 21, I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. Basically, this is history. This is God's plan. What's going to happen? And then all of most of verse 2 starts off with these kings of Persia. There were about 13 kings of Persia, but then verse 3 against the kingdom of Greece. So verse 3 is now going to allude to Alexander the Great. And then after him, this king of the south and king of the north. It's going to go back and forth between these kings. And so this is basically the Egyptian powers and the powers in the north. And then who's caught in between? Israel, Jerusalem, the land in between. And this fight is going to go back for a long period of time. That is now going to be summarized in this time. And this is very historic. A lot of scholars will say this lines up very, very well with history. But we know that the first king of the south was a guy, I just want to make sure I get his name right. The first king of the south was Ptolemy the first, and the first king of the north was Seleucus. And these two were allies at first, but then there was all sorts of problems that happened, and fights and intermarriages and all sorts of things were going on. This goes back and forth and basically covers a couple hundred years of history that happens here between all of these fights. Jerusalem is caught in the middle. It gets very hard for them, even though God's people are back in the land. And we have this silent period between the testaments. There is a lot going on politically, militarily, in the world that we sometimes forget, but a lot is there. So that is going on. And then once we finally get to verse 21 through verse 35, this goes back to describe Antiochus IV, who's going to be described here in all his exploits and everything he did. But once you get to the end of 35, it says that the wise might stumble, but they're going to be refined. They're going to be purified. They're going to be made spotless by God. The wise who are righteous and follow after God, that don't give in to Antiochus, don't give in to that form of government and to that godless pagan government, but stand firm in God, will until the end of time, and it will come at the appointed time, that there's going to be an appointed time when this happens. Okay, but then in verse 36 through 39, some see this as a kind of an introduction to this last king that's going to be described. Some see it as Antiochus, a further explanation of it, but most people say that doesn't fit. This is most likely talking about some very evil king that is still to come, i.e. the Antichrist, verses 40 through 45. But this there again, partial fulfillments through time. Evil kings, evil rulers, evil empires throughout the last 2,500 years. These are partially fulfillments of just this evil that is to keep going on until the final Antichrist figure comes. There are again different interpretations on that, but when we get to verse 45, it ends by saying, "Yet he will come to his end and no one will help him." There will be an end to wickedness. There will be an end to evil. God will rule and reign. So finally we get into chapter 12, the last chapter of the book, and this first few verses basically say that there's going to be a time of distress coming, and it's going to be bad. Verse 1, "But at that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in God's book, is going to be delivered, is going to be saved." And then verse 2 through 3 is beautiful. This is the only solid proof, the only solid verses in all of the Old Testament that speak to individual and by extension collective resurrection. Speaks definitively of a resurrection to come, and resurrection that's going to be very black and white. No one's on the edge. No one's on the fence on this one. It says that the righteous, verse 13, "The wise will shine and like brightness, and those who lead many to righteousness will shine forever. Some to everlasting life, some to shame." So you're either going to live a life that is honoring, glorifying, and righteous before God, or you won't. And there's no in between. And so more or less this is kind of starting to be the end of the vision, but then two other people come up and they kind of want to know, how long is this going to take? Verse 7, "It will be for a time, times, and half a time." If you literally, that's about a little over 3 to 3.5 year period, but that is a symbolic number. We don't know. We need to wait patiently. It's going to take time for all of this to be fulfilled. When the power of the holy people has been broken, all these things will be completed. This is kind of pessimistic, but we get it in Revelation 2. People are persecuted. People die. God's people are heavily, heavily persecuted. The church is assaulted. People in the church die, but the end will come. God will vindicate his people. They will be saved. He will come and make everything right, and there is a resurrection waiting for us. And so there again, verse 11, symbolic numbers for a period of time. But then it ends by saying, as for you, go on your way. You will rest, and at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. That idea of God's people getting the land that was always promised to them. So how beautiful this is to end this way, to say, look, you know what, even for us today, we don't know what today may bring. We don't know what tomorrow may bring. But like we said with apocalyptic literature, this is to encourage us that God is with us even in the worst of times, even in persecution. And this is also a call for us to stay faithful, to be patient. Don't worry, God is in charge. He is in control. The end will come, and you will receive an inheritance. Life everlasting with Jesus, a new heaven and a new earth. So I hope you've enjoyed this book of Daniel. It's super unique. I know this is a long message, but I hope you got some out of it. Just remember that God wins in the end. And because he wins, if you follow him, you win as well. Grace, mercy, and peace to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.